Catch up on all the live shows right here on africatechradio.com.
On 15th of September every year, the world reviews the state of democracy, and in this episode we'll be discussing how to uphold and promote its principles. I intentionally reached out to Open Society Foundation because of the work they do on the continent supporting and promoting democracy and democratic principles. The idea and principles of democracy tie very closely to citizen participation and freedom of speech, among other main pillars and tenets of democracy. In this episode, we'll review the state of democracy on the continent and discuss how we can empower children and youths to help resolve the flawed democratic processes on the continent. Let's meet our guest.
Thanks, Anthony, for the opportunity to have this chat. My name is Nhlanhla Ngwenya. I'm based in Johannesburg. I work with the Participation and Expression team under Open Society Africa. Basically, we support work around the promotion of the democracy on the continent, the right to freedom of expression, the right for citizens to participate in the manner in which they are governed, and all other issues related to democratic governance. I perceive this conversation to be really grounded on my own personal perspectives around the state of democracy in Africa as someone who has been working in this sector for years. This is not necessarily the position of the organization that I work for, even though I think I'll be a bit fair, because most of my conversations will really relate to my experiences, having worked for the organization for Open Society, as well as having also worked for civil society organizations in my previous life.
So let's start with the state of democracy on the continent. How would you rate it, and what are your comments about it?
We have seen quite a number of surveys that indicating that democracy is in trouble on the continent. And what we have read and seen in these surveys has been vindicated by what we are experiencing, our lived experiences on the continent, which points to the fact that there is some kind of standard democratic development and progress. Others may call it backsliding, others may call it regression. But the sum total of all this characterization points to the fact that democracy is in retreat on the continent. And it is disappointing that when one would have thought that we have taken 2 steps forward, we are seemingly taking more steps backwards. This is my feeling, and this is my reading of what is happening on the continent. And then there is also, I've been in a discussion with colleagues, robust discussion on the same subject. There is also a school of thought that says when we say democracy is in retreat on the continent, there is democratic regression, there is democratic backsliding. What do we mean? Is the assumption that we have had democracy on the continent, and there is a groundswell of opinion which actually is propagating the fact that in fact, when you look at the norms, the standards of what make up a democratic state, Africa has hardly met those standards. So why should we say there's democratic regression? In fact, when we have been begging to have democracy on the continent.
Are there some clear examples in the recent past?
Well, we have seen, to start with, we have seen what is happening in Senegal. We have seen the protests that have erupted in Senegal as a result of citizens' disagreement with the manner in which President Macky Sall and his administration are treating the opposition and dissent in Senegal. The manner in which they are weaponizing the law to disadvantage a strong opposition that many see as having a chance to give the current ruling elite in Senegal a run for their money in next year's elections. We have seen the constitutional coups in the region in the form of stolen elections. There is an uproar over the outcome of an election in Nigeria as we speak right now. There is an uproar over the elections outcome in Zimbabwe, which elections took place 2 or 3 weeks ago. There was an uproar over the Kenyan elections. And all these make up what is becoming clear on the continent. That is the electoral coups that have taken place, which coups and which electoral processes have yielded illegitimate government. And this is what is unraveling. And given the fact that the country, the continent, by end of 2023 would have held more than 23 elections. And I can bet my last cent, all these elections will hardly pass the legitimate test. Going back to what has happened in Gabon as well, which is also a manifestation of an illegitimate process that yielded an illegitimate leadership. So you can see that as much as Africa is holding elections, not all these countries or none of the countries are willing to abide and play the electoral game by the rules. So that's a big challenge. I will not talk about the military coups that have taken place in West Africa as well. So yes, there are signs that democracy is in trouble, like I said earlier on, if we are to go by these recent events, in addition to the scientific collation of data that has taken place by organizations that really are quite competent and are experts in assessing the state of democracy on the continent using their tested and robust tools that they've developed.
So if we're looking at the trends that have shaped democracy on the continent in the past 1 year, if we take out the coups, that's both the military coup and the others that's been described as electoral coups and whatnot, what other trends do you think have shaped the retrogression of democracy on the continent?
Well, I'm not going to debate why we should be taking them out, because that's a clear sign of what we are talking about. It's a clear sign in the sense that these protests that we are seeing that are being violently crushed on the continent are a manifestation of what has fundamentally gone wrong in terms of allowing citizens to freely express their political will, which is a fundamental pillar of democracy. So I'm not so sure why we should take them out as signs of a democratic decay or democratic rot. But you can also bring in the rise in the weaponization of the law on the continent. We are witnessing the intentions and an overdrive by those that wield power to come up with laws that will close civic spaces. We are in an era where governments are coming up with laws to regulate and control the activities of civic society and criminalize civil activism on the continent. And so all those things really point to a situation that is quite worrying and concerning if we are to say we are a democratic continent.
Okay, so yes, protests really important, and the civic space shrinking is also another very important point that you've noted, and thank you for those two.
And just to add, you also have seen the criminalization of expression online, the attempts and efforts to stifle expression online, the rise in surveillance tools, the rise in digital repression. Every time there's electoral processes, there are protests, there are elections, we are having reports of the internet being shut down, the internet being throttled, the internet being degraded, precisely to stop citizen mobilization, precisely to stop the free flow of information and allow those that wield power to manipulate the processes in their favor. So all these are signs of the problems that the continent is facing regarding the democratic practice.
These challenges are challenges that in the past, say, 1 decade or so, they're like new challenges that our democracies have been facing. Anyone on the government side would immediately bring up the issue of misinformation and false news and fake news, also hampering, democracy on the continent. How do you want to respond to this? How should we tackle the issue of misinformation, fake news, disinformation, and all that? Because it's also the other side of, the extreme. It's also on the extreme end of things.
Yeah, where I come from, the region that I'm based, there is a saying that you do not burn the whole house to kill a snake. which is what exactly our governments are doing. Yes, I mean, no one denies and disputes the fact that we have had harmful narratives that are being channeled and spewed through the internet and so forth. But we need to come up with an all-inclusive policy framework to try and deal with the problem. We can't use that as an excuse to impinge on citizens' basic liberties. What we are witnessing right now is not a genuine intention to deal with the disinformation scourge, but an attempt to use the disinformation scourge to justify the entrenchment of repression on the continent. This is where we then begin to question the genuineness of our governments when it comes to really dealing with this problem of disinformation. So you can't have a law that is overreaching, a law that is a calculated assault on citizens' basic freedoms on the basis that you are fighting disinformation. In any case, the problem of disinformation is not only coming from one side. We know that our governments have also invested in troll farms. They've invested in bots to disseminate and diffuse harmful narratives, toxic narratives, which narratives seek to insulate them from robust public scrutiny with a view to ensure that the governed are misinformed, that the governed do not confront them and demand accountability and accountable exploitation of their resources and deployment of their resources. So it goes both ways. And then showing that if we are to fight disinformation, there has to be a multi-stakeholder approach, and that multi-stakeholder approach requires genuine intentions by government to deal with the problem, not to hide behind the problem to assault and erode citizens' freedoms.
Now, the theme for 2023 is about empowering the next generation. First, is there a possibility to resolve the flawed democratic processes in our political systems across Africa? And secondly, how can we empower children and youths to help resolve this flawed system that we have on the continent?
I think there is. I mean, I know it's subject to debate on how best the continent can deal with these problems. And I think the strategies involved can be anchored on both internal and external approaches. Internally, which then touches on the second question that you had, I think it is all about building the citizen agency, leveraging on the youth bulge. Many of our countries on the continent are populated by young people. And the young people here, I'm talking of between maybe 18 years of age to 35. And these are actually forming the majority of our population on the continent. It is all about leveraging on this youth bulge because the future belongs to this youth bulge, empowering them with the necessary tools for them to participate in the governance of their communities, first at local level, at regional level, and at national level, and ensuring that they also are empowered to take up leadership positions across the tiers of our government systems in all of our countries, so that they themselves have ownership of the policies that are formulated in the country, their implementation and so forth, because the future belongs to them in all fairness. So this requires that we also deal with structural challenges that are impeding their participation, the socio-economic challenges that are impeding their participation, especially young women who are disadvantaged at so many levels in our body politic on the continent. And if they are deliberate efforts to ensure that we confront some of these challenges, I'm sure the young people will be having a better chance of fully engaging on the democratic processes. Now, going back to the question on the strategy, yes, I think externally, for instance, we need to deal with the double standards of the Western democracies. We need to ensure that the standards that they apply in ensuring there is democracy in one country should also apply to the other. But the challenge that we're having is we are seeing one country being treated separately and differently from country X, all depending on the foreign policy interests of developed democracies. And that then breeds a problem and a challenge. And the questions being, are we all truly driven by the desire to see democracy prosper, or there is more to it than what we are saying by word of mouth? And secondly, we need to look at the reformation of our regional and international bodies. We need to ensure that democracy is also practiced within these bodies. I mean, there's been so much calls by Africans for the reformation of the UN Security Council, for instance. You cannot expect that these multilateral institutions of governance and democracy practice exclusive or adopt exclusive policies, and then at the same time speak of democracy in the same breath. So the reformation and the practice of democracy has to start from some of these so-called champions of democracy, and it will trickle down to local levels. And then we also need to ensure that there are effective mechanisms to ensure that some of these regional bodies are empowered to deal with some of these democratic challenges on the continent. Yes, we do have ECOWAS, we do have SADC, we do have COMESA, we do have AU, but I think we need to be honest with ourselves. We need to be humble enough and appreciate some of the shortcomings that these bodies have in terms of ensuring that their protocols on democratic governance are not only ratified by some of the countries, but there is localized implementation to the latter by member states. So there are ways, I think there are strategies that can still be implemented to ensure this. But largely, I think the ultimate answer to all these challenges lies within the communities, locals themselves. If locals could have the agency to push back, if locals could have the agency to understand that participating in the governance processes is not a privilege but a right, I think we'll make some progress.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think this is where we'll draw the curtains. I actually look forward to maybe having other sessions, see if we can have more sessions on this, because I know South Africa is having an election and Nigeria just had our elections. Like this is like an election year, 2023, 2024, a lot of countries.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think we'll
Election Africa.
Yes. So I think we'll have more conversation about. But thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to catch up on all the live shows right here on africatechradio.com.